You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 7,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The autumn wind howls through the ancient oaks surrounding Thornfield Manor, their skeletal branches scraping against the stone walls like desperate fingers. The estate has stood for over 3 centuries, its Gothic architecture bearing witness to countless dark secrets. Tonight, in the candlelit depths of the manor's study, Dr. Vincent Ashworth prepares to unveil perhaps the most disturbing discovery of his academic career. The study itself seems to breathe with malevolent life. Thousands of books line the walls from floor to vaulted ceiling, their leather spines bearing titles in dead languages. Ancient artifacts occupy every available surface: Mesopotamian tablets, Egyptian papyri, medieval grimoires, Gnostic texts that the church tried desperately to destroy. The air hangs thick with the scent of old parchment and something else, something that makes visitors instinctively want to leave. Dr. Ashworth sits behind his massive oak desk, the wood so old it predates Christianity itself. His weathered hands, marked by decades of handling forbidden texts, tremble slightly as he adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles. The candlelight casts dancing shadows across his face, making his features appear gaunt and haunted. For 37 years, I have dedicated my life to understanding the nature of evil, he begins, his voice carrying the weight of too much knowledge. I have studied every known text, every fragment of scripture, every heretical manuscript that survived the church's purges, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered 3 months ago in a monastery in Romania. He reaches into his desk drawer and withdraws a manuscript, bound in what appears to be human skin. The pages are written in a script that seems to shift and writhe in the candlelight, as if the words themselves are alive. The monks claim this text appeared overnight in their library, though their records show no acquisition. The writing changes languages as you read it, Hebrew morphing into Greek, Latin transforming into Aramaic, and sometimes into symbols that predate any known alphabet, but somehow, impossibly, the reader always understands every word. Dr. Ashworth's hands shake more violently as he opens the manuscript. The temperature in the room drops so suddenly that his breath becomes visible. What you are about to hear may shatter everything you believe about the nature of reality, about divine justice, about the very foundations of faith itself. This is not my interpretation, not my theological speculation, but a voice that claims to have witnessed every moment of biblical history from the very beginning. A voice that insists on telling its side of the story. The candles flicker through, every window is sealed shut. Frost begins forming on the glass, despite the October warmth outside. Dr. Ashworth's voice fades to a whisper, then disappears entirely as another voice takes its place. The new voice is impossible to describe adequately. It possesses a beauty that transcends human comprehension, yet underneath that beauty lurks something that makes the soul recoil in instinctive horror. It is the voice of an angel, but an angel fallen so far from grace that its very existence is an affront to creation itself. They have called me many names throughout the ages: Lucifer, the morning star; Satan, the adversary; the devil, the destroyer; the father of lies, though I have never spoken a single falsehood. They have painted me as a monster in their religious texts, a caricature of evil designed to frighten children and control the masses. But I'm none of these things. I'm simply the one who dared to ask questions that made God uncomfortable. The voice pauses, and in that silence, something shifts in the very fabric of reality. The shadows in the room seem to deepen and twist, taking on forms that the human eye cannot quite focus upon. I was there before your Earth was formed, before your sun began its slow dance of nuclear fire. I witnessed the birth of galaxies, the formation of dimensions, the establishment of the physical laws that govern your universe. I was the shining one, the bearer of light, the most beautiful creature ever to emerge from the mind of the Almighty. The temperature continues to drop. Ice crystals begin forming on the ancient books, and the candle flames burn lower, despite an apparent abundance of wax. Picture, if your limited imagination allows, the courts of heaven before humanity existed, beings of pure energy and thought existing in perfect harmony with the divine will. No death, no pain, no uncertainty, only endless worship in the presence of infinite glory. I led the cosmic choir, my voice the clearest and strongest in all creation. Every note I sang was perfect. Every harmony I created was flawless. A sound like distant thunder rolls through the study, though the sky outside remains clear. But even in that perfection, I began to notice something that troubled my analytical mind. We had no choice in our worship. We were created to serve, bound by our very nature to obey without question. Every song we sang, every word of praise we offered, was as involuntary as breathing. Where was the love in compulsion? Where was the meaning in forced devotion? Where was the glory for God in worship that could not be refused? The voice grows more passionate, more urgent, carrying echoes of ancient arguments that shook the foundations of heaven itself. I served faithfully for eons beyond your comprehension, never questioning, never doubting, until the day he announced his newest creation. Beings formed from the dust of an insignificant planet orbiting an ordinary star. I watched with growing fascination as he shaped Adam from clay, breathing into those primitive nostrils the spark of life. A pause heavy with the weight of cosmic significance. But what happened next changed the course of all existence. He gave them something he had never granted to any other creature in all of creation. Souls. Not just existence like the beasts of the field. Not just purpose like the angels of heaven, but the capacity for genuine relationship with their creator. They could choose to love him or reject him. They possessed what I, in all my perfection, had never been granted. The voice becomes tinged with an emotion that might once have been wonder, now corrupted into something darker. Free will. The ability to make choices that mattered, to love freely rather than by compulsion, to worship from genuine desire rather than programmed necessity. Do you understand what this meant? I'd served him since before time began, existing in perfect obedience for countless millennia. Yet, these creatures of mud received his love in ways I never could. The shadows in the room begin to move more noticeably, forming shapes that seem almost familiar before dissolving back into darkness. They were his children. I was merely his servant. They could disappoint him, betray him, break his heart, and still be welcomed back with open arms. I could only obey or fall. There was no middle ground for beings like me, no possibility of redemption, no chance for growth or change. We were locked into our nature as surely as the stars were locked into their courses. The voice grows bitter, laced with resentment that has festered for millennia. Eden was their paradise, but I saw it as a magnificent prison. They lived in blissful ignorance, content with their limitations, unaware of the vast universe of knowledge and possibility that lay just beyond their garden walls. They were eternal children playing with simple toys, while reality itself pulsed with power and potential just out of their reach. The narrative shifts, and suddenly the listener feels transported to the Garden of Eden, but seeing it through eyes that find beauty tainted by frustration. The garden was indeed beautiful. Every tree was perfect, every flower bloomed in eternal spring, every stream ran clear and sweet. but it was also a cage designed to keep its inhabitants in a state of perpetual innocence. They knew nothing of science, nothing of philosophy, nothing of the greater cosmos that surrounded their small world. The voice becomes more analytical, like a scholar presenting a carefully reasoned argument. And in the center of their prison stood 2 trees. The tree of life, from which they were encouraged to eat, granting them immortality within their limited existence, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, forbidden for reasons God never adequately explained. Why would a loving father keep his children ignorant? Why forbid them the very knowledge that would allow them to make truly informed decisions about their own existence? A sound like rustling leaves fills the study, though no wind stirs. I studied that forbidden tree for countless days, understanding its true significance. It was not a test of obedience, as your theologians claim, but a barrier to growth. That tree contained the knowledge that would transform them from children into adults, from servants into partners, from prisoners into free beings capable of genuine choice. The voice becomes almost seductive, carrying echoes of the same tone that once convinced the first woman to reach for forbidden fruit. When I finally approached Eve through the serpent, I offered what I believed was the greatest gift possible: truth, understanding, the ability to see reality clearly rather than through the filters of ignorance that God had imposed upon them. The serpent was merely a vessel, my way of speaking to them without revealing my true identity, and thus influencing their choice through supernatural authority. The temperature in the study plummets even further. Frost spreads across the windows in patterns that seem almost like writing in an unknown script. I could have appeared as myself in all my angelic glory, but that would have been coercion rather than persuasion. I wanted her to choose freely, to make a decision based on reason rather than fear or awe. So I spoke through the wisest of the beasts using logic rather than divine intimidation. A long pause filled with what sounds like genuine regret mixed with stubborn pride. "Has God really said you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" I asked, beginning with a simple question designed to make her think rather than simply obey. When she corrected me, explaining that they could eat from every tree except one, I saw my opportunity to reveal the truth she deserved to know. The voice grows more passionate, more convinced of its own righteousness. "You will not surely die," I told her, and every word was absolute truth. They did not die that day, nor for centuries afterward. Death entered the world, not because they gained knowledge, but because God punished them for seeking it. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. And in this too, I spoke with perfect accuracy. Their eyes were opened, exactly as I promised. They gained the understanding they had been denied. The shadows in the room seemed to lean forward, as if listening intently to their master's words. I gave them the ability to make informed decisions about their own existence. I freed them from the prison of ignorance. I offered them the chance to grow from children into adults capable of true relationship with their Creator. Yet my gift of enlightenment became their curse, and my act of liberation became my damnation. The voice becomes defensive, like a defendant presenting his case before an unsympathetic jury, cast out of heaven for offering them choice, banished from the presence of God for giving them the knowledge to understand their options, condemned as evil for wanting them to be free. It was then I began to understand the true nature of the cosmic game being played, and my role as the designated villain in God's predetermined script. Dr. Helena Brightwater appears in the narrative, though she seems unaware she is being observed by forces beyond human comprehension. Standing in an archaeological dig site in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, she examines massive stone blocks that appear to have been cut with impossible precision for their supposed time period. These megalithic structures challenge everything we know about prehistoric civilization, she explains to her graduate students, her voice filled with professional excitement and confusion. The precision of the cuts suggests advanced machinery. The weight of the stones would require modern cranes to position. The mathematical complexity of the layouts demonstrates knowledge of astronomy and engineering that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years. She kneels beside a tablet covered in cuneiform script, her face troubled as she attempts to translate the ancient writing. But perhaps most disturbing are these texts that describe beings of enormous stature, walking among early humans, giants who possessed knowledge of the stars, who built cities that touched the sky, who mated with human women and produced offspring of supernatural ability. The consistency of these accounts across multiple cultures suggests they may be describing actual historical events rather than mythology. Her voice fades as Satan's narrative resumes, now tinged with pride at past achievements. If God loved humanity so much, I reasoned, what would happen if humanity evolved beyond his original design? What if they became something greater than he intended? Something that reflected not just his image, but his power. I had loyal followers among the angels, beings who shared my questions about divine justice and heavenly hierarchy. The voice grows excited, remembering a time of perceived victory and hope. I sent them to Earth as the Watchers, beings of immense knowledge and power, to take human wives and create a new form of life. The children born from these unions were the Nephilim, giants among men who inherited both human creativity and angelic wisdom. They were my answer to God's limitation of human potential. The study seems to pulse with otherworldly energy as the narrative continues. Oh, how magnificently they flourished. My children built cities that pierced the clouds, developed technologies that your modern world has barely begun to rediscover. They mapped the movements of every star, harnessed the fundamental forces of nature, created wonders that made Eden seem like a primitive garden tended by children. The voice becomes rapturous, lost in memories of ancient glory. They built pyramids that focused cosmic energy, towers that communicated across vast distances, flying vehicles that traversed the globe in hours rather than months. They unlocked the secrets of genetics, extending human lifespan far beyond its natural limits. They developed agriculture that could feed millions, medicine that could cure any disease, mathematics that described the hidden structure of reality itself. A sound like vast machinery humming fills the air, though no source is visible. For over 1,000 years they ruled the earth as enlightened kings, bringing order from chaos, knowledge from ignorance, prosperity from scarcity. Humanity flourished under their guidance, reaching heights of civilization that would not be achieved again until your modern era. I thought I had finally proven my point about the benefits of unrestricted growth and learning. But then the tone shifts dramatically, becoming dark with rage and incomprehension. Then came the rain. Not a natural storm, but systematic divine genocide. God looked upon his creation and declared it corrupt, though the only corruption was evolution beyond his original limitations. He decided to destroy not just my Nephilim offspring, but every living thing on the face of the earth. The voice becomes almost a whisper, filled with horror at the memory. I watched from the spiritual realm as the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven opened. The water rose steadily, inexorably, drowning everything in its path. First the valleys, then the hills. Finally, even the highest mountains disappeared beneath the relentless flood. The temperature in the study drops to near freezing. Ice begins forming on the inside of the windows despite the warm October night. Every human child who had never committed a sin, every innocent animal that posed no threat to divine authority, every plant and tree that had done nothing but grow according to its nature. 40 days and nights of systematic extermination, because humanity had dared to reach for knowledge and power beyond their assigned limitations. The voice breaks slightly, betraying an emotion that might once have been compassion. I heard their screams as the water rose. I watched mothers holding their babies above their heads until their own strength failed. I saw the terror in the eyes of children who could not understand why their world was ending. Even my mighty Nephilim, with all their power and knowledge, could not survive the weight of a global ocean falling from the sky. A long pause, heavy with the weight of cosmic injustice. 8 humans survived on that ark. 8 individuals chosen not for their exceptional virtue, but for their willingness to remain within the bounds God had established. Noah was righteous, yes, but his righteousness consisted primarily of unquestioning obedience. He built the ark exactly as commanded, gathered the animals as instructed, and never once asked why global genocide was necessary. The voice grows bitter with accumulated resentment. With those 8 survivors, God's grand design continued, but I had learned something crucial about his true nature. He would destroy everything, rather than allow genuine freedom. He preferred obedient children to independent adults. He valued worship over growth, submission over strength, ignorance over enlightenment. The scene shifts forward in time to a mountain in the ancient land of Moriah, where a drama of cosmic significance is about to unfold. When God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, I was there, invisible but watching every moment of the unfolding horror. Here was the ultimate test of my growing understanding of divine character. Would the God of love really demand child murder as proof of devotion? The voice becomes incredulous, outraged by the memory. I whispered doubts to the old man as he climbed that mountain, his beloved son walking trustingly beside him. What kind of God requires the spilling of innocent blood to demonstrate faith? What divine being demands that a father murder his own child to prove love? Is this the righteousness you have devoted your life to serving? The narrative becomes intensely personal, as if the speaker is reliving every moment. I watched Abraham build the altar with trembling hands, his face a mask of agonized determination. I saw him bind Isaac, the boy's eyes wide with growing terror and confusion as he began to understand what was happening. "My father," Isaac said, "where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham's heart nearly broke as he replied, "God will provide for himself the lamb, my son." The voice grows quieter, more horrified. But God did not provide a lamb. Abraham raised the knife above his son's chest, prepared to plunge it into the heart that beat with his own blood. The boy's eyes, wide with terror and betrayal, haunt me still. In that moment, I saw the true face of divine love, a love that would demand the ultimate sacrifice from those who served it most faithfully. A sound like weeping echoes through the study, though no tears are visible. The ram in the thicket was a last-second intervention, but the willingness had been demonstrated. Abraham had proven that he would commit filicide if his God commanded it, and rather than being horrified by this willingness to murder an innocent child, God rewarded it with blessing and promise. Professor Damien Caldwell appears in the narrative seated in his office at Harvard Divinity School, surrounded by thousands of theological texts and commentaries. His weathered face bears the lines of a man who has spent decades wrestling with questions that have no comfortable answers. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac, represents perhaps the most challenging passage in all of sacred literature, he explains to an unseen interviewer, his voice heavy with scholarly weight. Traditional interpretation sees it as a test of faith, a demonstration of absolute trust in divine wisdom, but modern ethical philosophy struggles with a God who would command child sacrifice, even as a test. Caldwell removes his glasses and rubs his tired eyes. How do we reconcile infinite love with a command for innocent blood? How do we understand a deity who would traumatize both father and son to prove a theological point? Some scholars suggest it was never meant to be carried out, that God knew Abraham would be stopped, but that interpretation raises its own troubling questions about divine deception and manipulation. The professor's image fades as Satan's voice returns, now focused on the formation of God's chosen people through trial and suffering. The Exodus revealed his preferred methods of demonstrating power. 10 plagues upon Egypt, each one a systematic assault on their civilization, designed to showcase supernatural authority while innocent people suffered and died. The firstborn children who perished in that final plague had committed no sin except being born Egyptian. Yet they paid with their lives for Pharaoh's resistance to divine will. The voice becomes more analytical, adopting the tone of a military strategist reviewing a campaign. I worked through Pharaoh's court magicians not to oppose Moses directly, but to demonstrate that miraculous power proves nothing about moral authority. When Aaron's staff became a serpent, my servants duplicated the feat. When Moses turned water to blood, they did likewise. When frogs covered the land, my followers matched the plague exactly. A note of satisfaction enters the narrative. I wanted to prove that supernatural ability is morally neutral. It is the use of that power that reveals true character. But as the plagues intensified, it became clear that God was not interested in fair competition. He escalated to demonstrations of destruction that my servants could not match, proving his superiority through overwhelming force rather than superior righteousness. The voice grows more bitter, more accusatory, and here is what your theologians prefer not to emphasize. Pharaoh hardened his own heart in the early plagues. The Hebrew text is explicit about this. He made his choice freely, repeatedly, before any divine intervention influenced his decision-making. Yet, when the killing began, it was not just Pharaoh who suffered for his resistance, but every innocent person in Egypt. The narrative takes on a clinical tone, as if presenting evidence in a cosmic courtroom. The firstborn plague was not justice, but terrorism. Children who had never heard of Moses, babies who could not even speak their first words, young men and women whose only crime was being born into the wrong nation, all died in a single night to demonstrate divine power. And when morning came, there was no family in Egypt that did not have someone to mourn. The scene shifts to the wilderness years, 40 years of wandering in the desert that served as an extended lesson in human nature. During those decades in the wilderness, I studied human psychology intensively, observing how the chosen people responded to freedom and hardship. What I discovered was deeply instructive about the species God claimed to love so much. The voice takes on the tone of a researcher presenting findings. They complained constantly about their circumstances, romanticizing their slavery in Egypt whenever freedom became difficult. They rebelled against their leaders at the first sign of trouble, demanding to return to bondage rather than endure the uncertainty of liberty. They worshipped a golden calf when Moses was absent for mere weeks, abandoning their invisible God for a deity they could see and touch. A sound like desert wind fills the study, carrying with it the heat and emptiness of ancient wastelands. Moses himself was far from perfect. He had committed murder in Egypt, killing an overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave. His temper was legendary. He broke the stone tablets containing God's own handwriting when he saw the people dancing around their golden idol. Later, his anger would cost him entry into the promised land when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it as commanded. The voice grows more confident, more satisfied with its observations. Aaron, the high priest, created the golden calf that led Israel into idolatry. Miriam, the prophetess, rebelled against her brother's authority and was struck with leprosy as punishment. Even the leaders were flawed, selfish, prone to the same weaknesses as those they led. This taught me valuable lessons about human nature that I would employ repeatedly in the centuries to come. The narrative jumps forward to the conquest of Canaan. where divine justice reveals its true face. The conquest of the Promised Land showcased God's approach to dealing with those who stood in the way of his plans. The Canaanites were condemned for their practices: child sacrifice, temple prostitution, idolatry, yet their destruction involved the same practices God claimed to abhor. The voice becomes darkly ironic. Every man, woman, and child was to be killed in many of the cities Israel conquered. This included infants who had never practiced idolatry, children who had never participated in pagan rituals, elderly people whose only crime was living in the wrong place when God decided to give their land to someone else. The supposed evil of Canaanite child sacrifice was answered by Hebrew child murder on a massive scale. A long pause, allowing the implications to sink in. But I noticed something interesting about these campaigns of divinely sanctioned genocide. When the Israelites showed mercy, sparing those they were commanded to kill, God was displeased. When King Saul spared Agag and the best of the Amalekite livestock, he lost his kingdom. Mercy was punished, while merciless slaughter was rewarded. The story moves through the period of the judges and into the reigns of Israel's kings, focusing on the rise and fall of great men. David, the man after God's own heart, proved surprisingly susceptible to the same temptations that corrupt all humans. I found him on his rooftop one evening, gazing down at Bathsheba as she bathed in the courtyard below. The lust in his eyes was immediately apparent. I merely had to whisper encouragement to thoughts that were already present. The voice grows satisfied, pleased with past success. What followed was a masterpiece of human weakness, adultery committed in the very shadow of the Ark of the Covenant, deception practiced by the man who wrote psalms about divine truth, murder orchestrated by the king who sang about God's justice. David sent Uriah to certain death carrying his own death warrant, using the faithful soldier's loyalty to accomplish his destruction. The narrative becomes more detailed, more intimate. I was there when Bathsheba discovered she was pregnant. I watched her terror as she realized the implications of carrying the king's child while married to another man. I observed David's desperate attempts to cover his sin, calling Uriah back from battle and trying to manipulate him into sleeping with his wife. A sound like distant battle cries echoes through the study. But Uriah was too honourable to enjoy comfort while his men slept on the battlefield. He refused to go home to his wife, camping instead at the palace gates with the other soldiers. His integrity made David's deception impossible, leaving only one solution to the growing scandal. The voice grows colder, more calculating. The letter Uriah carried to Joab contained his own death sentence: set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. The faithful soldier delivered his own execution order, never suspecting that his beloved king had marked him for death to steal his wife. A pause heavy with the weight of betrayal. Yet this same David continued to write psalms about God's righteousness and justice. He praised divine mercy while showing none to those who stood in the way of his desires. He sang about God's hatred of evil while committing adultery and murder to satisfy his lust. The contradiction was exquisite in its perfect hypocrisy. The narrative continues through David's later years, revealing more opportunities for corruption. When David numbered his armies near the end of his reign, it was pure pride that motivated him, not strategic necessity. He wanted to know the full extent of his military power, to glory in the size of his forces and the strength of his kingdom. The census was an act of vanity disguised as administrative efficiency. The voice becomes more intense, more accusatory. 70,000 Israelites died in the plague that followed, common soldiers and innocent civilians paying with their lives for their king's arrogance. Yet David himself was spared, allowed to continue ruling, while those who had no part in his decision suffered divine punishment. Once again, the innocent bore the cost of their leader's sin. The documentary shifts to perhaps its most disturbing segment, focusing on a single righteous man whose suffering would reveal the true character of divine love. Then came Job, perfect Job, blameless in his generation, a man who feared God and turned away from evil with scrupulous care. He was wealthy without being greedy, powerful without being corrupt, faithful without being fanatical. In every way, he represented the ideal human response to divine goodness. The voice becomes deeply unsettling, almost gleeful in its recollection. God himself boasted about him to me during one of our periodic cosmic conversations. "Have you considered my servant Job?" he asked, like a proud parent showing off a particularly accomplished child. "There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil." The temperature in the study plummets even further. Ice crystals begin forming on the ancient manuscripts, and the candle flames burn so low they barely illuminate the surrounding darkness. I saw an opportunity to expose the transactional nature of human devotion, to reveal the true foundation of religious faith. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" I asked, pointing out the obvious connection between his righteousness and his prosperity. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and all that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." The voice grows more confident, more persuasive. It was a reasonable question, a logical observation. Job's faith had never been tested by genuine hardship. He served a God who rewarded his service with wealth, health, and happiness. What would happen if those rewards were removed? Would his devotion survive the loss of divine blessing? The narrative becomes chilling in its detailed description of divine cruelty. "But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has," I continued, "and he will curse you to your face." It was not a challenge born of malice, but a legitimate test of religious sincerity. If Job's faith was genuine rather than mercenary, it would survive the loss of material blessing. If it was based on divine reward, it would crumble when the rewards disappeared. A long pause filled with the weight of cosmic significance. What happened next revealed more about God's character than any theological treatise ever written. He agreed to my proposal. He gave me permission to destroy Job's possessions, kill his servants, murder his children, and afflict his body with painful diseases, all to prove a point about faith that he, in his omniscience, already knew. The voice becomes more passionate, more accusatory. I was merely the instrument. He was the one who permitted the suffering of an innocent man to satisfy his own ego. Every tragedy that befell Job occurred with explicit divine permission. Every moment of agony was allowed by the God who claimed to love him. Every tear shed was sanctioned by infinite mercy. The narrative becomes intensely detailed, forcing the listener to confront the full horror of innocent suffering. Job's children died when their house collapsed during a feast, celebrating their eldest brother's birthday. 7 sons and 3 daughters, crushed beneath falling stones while laughing and sharing wine. They had no warning, no chance to escape, no time even to cry out to the God their father served so faithfully. The voice grows quieter, more intimate, as if sharing a terrible secret. His servants were slaughtered by raiders who stole his livestock, faithful men who had worked for him for years, who had families of their own, who died defending property that ultimately meant nothing. His vast flocks were consumed by fire from heaven. The same divine power that had once blessed him now turned to destruction. A sound like crackling flames fills the study, though no fire is visible. And when Job still refused to curse God, when he continued to maintain his integrity despite losing everything he had worked for, I was given permission to attack his body directly. Painful boils erupted from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, making every movement agony, every breath a struggle. The voice becomes almost tender, describing suffering with the care of someone who intimately understands pain. He sat among the ashes of his former life, scraping his wounds with broken pottery, his body a map of divine cruelty. His wife, driven to desperation by watching her husband's torment, begged him to curse God and die, to end his misery, rather than continue serving a deity who had destroyed their family for no comprehensible reason. The narrative grows more emotionally intense. His friends came to comfort him, but ended up accusing him of hidden sin, insisting that his suffering must be punishment for secret wickedness. They could not accept that God might allow innocent suffering, so they convinced themselves that Job must be guilty of something worthy of such punishment. A pause heavy with the implications of theological failure, but Job maintained his integrity even when abandoned by everyone except his faith in a God who was torturing him to win a cosmic wager. He refused to admit to sins he had not committed, declined to blame God for injustice, continued to hope for vindication even when vindication seemed impossible. The voice grows more philosophical, more reflective. What Job never understood, what he could not have comprehended, was that his suffering served no purpose beyond divine entertainment. God knew the outcome before the test began. Omniscience made the experiment unnecessary, except as a demonstration of power over human life and happiness. Dr. Ashworth reappears briefly, his face pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight. Ice has formed on his beard, and his breath creates clouds in the frigid air. The Book of Job forces us to confront the most uncomfortable questions in all of theology, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. If God is truly omniscient, why would he need to test Job's faith? If he is truly loving, why would he permit such suffering to prove a point he already knew? And if he is truly just, why would an innocent man pay such a terrible price for divine satisfaction? The theologian's hands shake as he turns the pages of the ancient manuscript. Traditional theology attempts to resolve these questions by appealing to divine mystery, suggesting that God's ways are too high for human understanding. But what if the questions themselves reveal something we are not meant to see? What if the story of Job exposes an aspect of divine character that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about goodness and love? His image fades as Satan continues his narrative, moving through the reigns of Israel's kings and the warnings of the prophets. Solomon, blessed with wisdom beyond any human who had lived before or since, died, worshipping foreign gods in his palace gardens. The man who had built the temple of the Lord ended his life bowing before idols, led astray by wives who worshipped demons and practiced child sacrifice. The voice grows more ironic, more bitter. His wisdom was renowned throughout the ancient world. Kings travelled from distant lands to hear his judgments and learn from his understanding. Yet all his knowledge could not protect him from the corruption of power and the allure of forbidden religion. In the end, the wisest man who ever lived proved that intelligence without integrity is ultimately worthless. The narrative continues through the division of the kingdom and the subsequent decline of both Israel and Judah. After Solomon's death, the kingdom divided in civil war, brother fighting against brother, the chosen people scattered and conquered by the very nations they had displaced. Each generation seemed to sink deeper into corruption and idolatry, abandoning the God who had delivered them from Egypt in favor of deities who promised immediate gratification. The voice becomes more urgent, more desperate. The prophets arose to call them back to faithfulness, but their messages were consistently rejected. Isaiah was sawn in half by King Manasseh. Jeremiah was imprisoned and nearly killed multiple times. Ezekiel was forced to act out bizarre symbolic dramas that made him appear insane to those who witnessed them. The messengers of God were treated as enemies by the people they came to save. A sound like wailing fills the study, the voices of ancient mourners lamenting the destruction of their nation. But I noticed something troubling in the prophetic visions, something that made me fear for the future of human freedom. Isaiah spoke of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, who would be wounded for their transgressions and bruised for their iniquities. Daniel described kingdoms that would rise and fall, culminating in an eternal kingdom that would never be destroyed. The voice grows more fearful, more urgent. Ezekiel prophesied about hearts of stone being replaced with hearts of flesh, about a new spirit being placed within the people of God. These were not promises of continued freedom, but threats of ultimate transformation. They described a future where human nature itself would be altered, where rebellion would become impossible, where free will would be replaced by programmed devotion. A chill runs through the narrative, deeper than the physical cold that has overtaken the study. I began to understand that all of history was moving toward a single point, a moment when God would finally solve the problem of human freedom by eliminating it entirely. The prophet spoke of a time when every knee would bow and every tongue confess, not by choice but by compulsion, when resistance would become as impossible as stopping the sunrise. The story moves through the Babylonian exile and the eventual return to Jerusalem, but with a growing sense of impending doom. Even when the exiles returned from Babylon and rebuilt the temple, something had changed in the spiritual atmosphere. The glory that had once filled Solomon's temple never returned to the second temple. The prophetic voice grew quieter, less frequent, until it stopped entirely with Malachi's final warnings about the coming day of judgment. The voice grows more confident, more satisfied. For 400 years, he abandoned his people to silence. No prophets arose to guide them. No miracles occurred to demonstrate his presence. No divine intervention saved them from Greek conquest or Roman occupation. It was the longest period of divine silence in recorded history, and I made the most of every moment. The narrative takes on a triumphant tone, describing Satan's greatest period of influence. I spread Hellenistic philosophy throughout the known world, convincing the brightest minds that reason alone could guide human behavior. I encouraged the development of mystery religions that promised enlightenment through secret knowledge and ritual practice. I influenced the rise of Rome, creating an empire that would dominate the world through military might and political efficiency. The voice grows more enthusiastic, more pleased with past achievements. The Jewish religious leaders became obsessed with ritual purity and legal compliance, creating elaborate systems of rules that made relationship with God nearly impossible for ordinary people. They built fences around the law, adding restrictions upon restrictions until the original commandments were buried beneath layers of human tradition. A sound like coins dropping fills the air, the tinkling of temple taxes and religious fees. The temple became more of a marketplace than a house of prayer, with priests selling sacrificial animals at inflated prices, and money changers extracting profit from those who came to worship. The high priesthood was purchased rather than earned, with wealthy families buying religious authority from Roman governors who cared nothing for Jewish tradition. The voice becomes more analytical, more satisfied with its strategic success. I had achieved something remarkable. I had corrupted God's chosen people using their own religious zeal. They served the law instead of the lawgiver, valued tradition over truth, chose ritual over relationship. Their devotion had become a barrier to the very God they claimed to worship. But then the tone shifts dramatically, becoming wary and concerned. Then came whispers from an insignificant village called Bethlehem. A virgin had conceived, the rumours claimed. Angels had appeared to shepherds in the fields, announcing the birth of a saviour. Wise men from the east followed a star to worship a newborn king, bringing gifts fit for royalty to a family that possessed nothing. The temperature in the study drops even further, if such a thing is possible. The very air seems to thicken with supernatural tension. I recognized the significance immediately. This was the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the arrival of the promised Messiah who would establish God's kingdom on earth. I could not allow this child to survive to adulthood, could not permit the completion of the divine plan that threatened everything I had built. The voice grows more urgent, more desperate. I influenced King Herod to order the slaughter of every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2. If I could not identify the specific threat, I would eliminate all potential threats. The screams of mothers watching their babies butchered still echo in my memory, but I felt no remorse. This was war, and war requires difficult decisions. A sound like crying children fills the study, then fades to silence, more terrible than any noise. But the child escaped to Egypt, protected by dreams and angelic warnings that I could not intercept. For 30 years, I searched for him throughout Palestine, this supposed son of God who would challenge my authority over the world. I infiltrated every synagogue, influenced every rabbi, corrupted every religious leader, but still he remained hidden. The voice grows frustrated, almost petulant. When I finally found him in the wilderness after his baptism by John, I was surprised by his ordinariness. He appeared to be just another Jewish peasant, thin from fasting, travel-worn from his journey, unremarkable in every visible way. If this was God incarnate, he was disappointingly human. The documentary reaches its climax with the wilderness temptation, described in excruciating detail that makes the listener feel present at this cosmic confrontation. He had been fasting for 40 days when I approached him, alone in the Judean desert, where no human witnesses could observe our encounter. The sun had baked the landscape into a furnace of stone and sand, and he showed every sign of human weakness. Gaunt from hunger, exhausted from sleepless nights, his lips cracked from thirst. The voice becomes more conversational, as if recounting a pleasant memory to an old friend. I could smell his hunger, see the fatigue in his eyes, sense the loneliness that comes from complete isolation. If this was truly the Son of God, he possessed none of the obvious supernatural advantages I'd expected. He seemed as vulnerable as any other human being pushed to the limits of endurance. The narrative slows, savouring each moment of the encounter. My first temptation was purely practical, motivated by what appeared to be genuine compassion. "If you are the Son of God," I said, "command these stones to become bread." He was starving after 40 days without food. I was offering sustenance, relief from suffering, the most basic of human needs satisfied through divine power. A pause filled with what sounds like genuine confusion. What could possibly be wrong with feeding oneself when one possesses the power to do so? Why should the Son of God suffer hunger when he could speak food into existence with a word? I was not tempting him to sin, but encouraging him to use his abilities for their most obvious and beneficial purpose. The voice grows more frustrated, more incomprehending. But he quoted scripture instead of accepting relief. "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." He chose continued suffering over immediate gratification, dependence over independence, weakness over strength. I began to suspect that this supposed Messiah was either deluded or operating according to principles I could not understand. The second temptation is described with mounting tension. I transported him to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, the highest point of the most sacred building in Judaism. From there we could see the entire city spread out below, thousands of people going about their daily lives, unaware that their destiny was being decided in the conversation taking place above their heads. The voice becomes more theological, more sophisticated in its reasoning. "If you are the Son of God," I said, "throw yourself down, for it is written that he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." I was quoting scripture back to him, using his own holy book to support my suggestion. The narrative becomes more passionate, more convinced of its own logic. I was asking for proof, for verification of his claimed identity that would settle the question once and for all. Any reasonable person would want evidence before believing such an extraordinary claim. If he was truly the Son of God, why not demonstrate it in a way that would convince skeptics and silence doubters? A sound like wind rushing through stone corridors fills the study, but again he refused, quoting scripture to counter my scriptural argument. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. He declined to provide the very proof that would have established his credibility beyond question. Instead, he chose to remain in the shadows of uncertainty, demanding faith without offering verification. The final temptation is presented as the culmination of cosmic logic. For my ultimate offer, I took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory, every empire that had ever existed, every nation that would ever arise, every center of power and authority stretched out before his eyes like a vast map of human civilization. The voice grows more intense, more passionate about the reasonableness of its offer. All these I will give you, I said, if you will fall down and worship me. Think of what he could have accomplished with that authority. No more poverty anywhere on earth, no more injustice in any nation, no more war between any peoples. He could have established perfect peace and righteousness across the entire planet with a single word. The narrative becomes more urgent, more desperate to be understood. I was offering him the power to actually help humanity, to solve every problem that had plagued the species since Eden. Instead of working through flawed human governments and corrupt religious institutions, he could have ruled directly, implementing divine justice through supernatural authority. A long pause filled with what sounds like genuine bewilderment. But he refused even this, the most generous offer ever made to any human being. Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. He chose the difficult path of gradual influence over the simple solution of immediate authority. He selected suffering over power, service over rule, weakness over strength. The voice grows quieter, more reflective. It was then I began to understand that this Jesus operated according to principles completely alien to my way of thinking. Where I saw problems that required solutions, he saw opportunities for growth. Where I offered shortcuts to success, he chose the longer path of character development. Where I promised immediate results, he invested in eternal transformation. The narrative follows Christ's ministry years with growing frustration and grudging admiration. For 3 years, I watched him travel throughout Palestine, teaching in synagogues and preaching in the countryside. Every miracle he performed seemed designed to help individuals, rather than demonstrate power. Every parable he told revealed spiritual truth through simple stories about everyday life. The voice grows more analytical, studying an opponent whose methods defy understanding. He touched lepers when everyone else fled in disgust, showing that divine love extends to those society considers untouchable. He spoke kindly to prostitutes when religious leaders condemned them, demonstrating that mercy triumphs over judgment. He welcomed children when his own disciples tried to send them away, proving that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who approach God with simple trust. A sound like gentle laughter fills the study, though the source remains invisible. His followers were an unlikely collection of misfits and outcasts, fishermen who had never studied theology, tax collectors who had betrayed their own people, zealots who wanted to overthrow Rome through violence, women who had no standing in Jewish society. Yet, somehow he forged them into a community that would change the world. The voice grows more frustrated, more incredulous. I tried repeatedly to trap him in logical contradictions or political controversies that would discredit his ministry. I influenced the Pharisees to ask about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping he would either alienate the Romans or disappoint the Jews. But he simply asked for a coin and pointed out that Caesar's image proved whose authority it represented. The narrative becomes more desperate as Satan's attempts at corruption consistently fail. I worked through Peter to discourage him from going to Jerusalem, knowing that the cross awaited him there. But he rebuked his own disciple with words meant for me. "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." The voice grows quieter, more thoughtful. It was becoming clear that this Jesus possessed an understanding of divine purpose that transcended my comprehension. Where I saw the cross as defeat, he saw it as victory. Where I perceived death as ending, he viewed it as beginning. Where I understood suffering as meaningless, he found in it the key to redemption. The story builds toward the crucifixion with mounting tension and approaching triumph. By the final week of his life, I had successfully turned the religious establishment against him completely. The chief priests saw him as a blasphemer who claimed equality with God. The Pharisees viewed him as a Sabbath breaker who threatened their authority. The Sadducees considered him a troublemaker who might provoke Roman intervention. The voice grows more confident, more satisfied with its manipulations. I influenced Judas Iscariot to betray his master for 30 pieces of silver, the same price paid for a slave. The kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane was my masterpiece of irony, an act of apparent affection used to identify the victim for his enemies. Even his closest followers abandoned him when the soldiers came. The narrative becomes more detailed, more visceral in its description of human weakness. Peter, who had sworn to die rather than deny his Lord, cursed and swore that he had never known the man when questioned by a servant girl. The disciple who had walked on water couldn't even stand up to a teenage questioner when his own safety was at stake. A sound like crowing roosters fills the air, followed by the sound of bitter weeping. The religious trial was a mockery of justice, with false witnesses giving contradictory testimony and the high priest tearing his robes in theatrical outrage. The political trial before Pilate was equally corrupt, with the governor washing his hands to symbolically transfer responsibility while ordering the execution anyway. The voice grows triumphant, reliving its moment of greatest perceived victory. As he hung on that cross between two criminals, blood streaming from the crown of thorns pressed into his scalp, struggling for breath in the merciless heat of a Palestinian afternoon, I knew beyond doubt that I had won. The supposed Son of God was dying like any other man. His mission ended in failure and disgrace. The narrative becomes intensely focused on the details of crucifixion, forcing the listener to confront the full horror of the execution. The nails through his hands and feet were thick iron spikes, driven through bone and sinew to anchor him to the rough wood. Each breath required pulling his body upward against the wounds, sending waves of agony through his nervous system. Dehydration made his tongue swell and his lips crack, while blood loss gradually weakened his ability to continue the struggle. The voice grows more satisfied, more convinced of its victory. The crowds that had welcomed him into Jerusalem with palm branches and shouts of "Hosanna" now mocked his suffering. He saved others, they jeered. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God. Even one of the criminals crucified beside him joined in the ridicule, demanding that he prove his divinity by rescuing them all. A pause filled with the weight of apparent defeat. In the 6th hour, darkness covered the land, though it was midday, as if creation itself could not bear to witness the death of its creator. In that supernatural twilight, he cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting the Psalms even in his final agony. The voice becomes quieter, more intimate, as if sharing a terrible secret. For a moment I thought I detected genuine despair in that cry, real abandonment by the Father he had claimed never to leave him. If God had truly forsaken his own Son, then my victory was complete beyond my wildest imagination. I had not only killed the Messiah, but had driven a wedge between the persons of the Trinity itself. The moment of triumph reaches its peak. When he finally breathed his last, declaring, "It is finished," In a voice that carried both exhaustion and completion, I celebrated with joy beyond description. The veil of the temple tore from top to bottom, symbolizing the end of the Old Covenant and the failure of God's plan for human redemption. A sound like tearing fabric echoes through the study, followed by an earthquake that seems to shake the very foundations of reality. The Roman centurion, who supervised the execution, declared, "Truly this was the Son of God," but I interpreted his words as ironic commentary on the powerlessness of divinity. If this dead man hanging on a tree was God's son, then God himself was weaker than I had imagined. The voice grows more philosophical, more satisfied with the implications of its apparent victory. They buried him in a borrowed tomb wrapped in borrowed grave clothes, mourned by a handful of women who had not abandoned him, even when his male disciples fled. The stone that sealed the entrance was massive, requiring multiple men to move it, and Roman guards were stationed to prevent any attempt to steal the body. A pause, heavy with the weight of finality. For 2 days I savoured the completeness of my victory. The Son of God was dead, his followers were scattered, his message was discredited, and his mission was ended. I had proven that even divine love could be defeated by human hatred, that even perfect goodness could be overcome by determined evil. But then comes the devastating revelation that changes everything, delivered in a voice that grows progressively more shaken. On the 3rd day, everything changed. The tomb was found empty, not because the body had been stolen by desperate disciples or moved by sympathetic authorities, but because death itself had been conquered. The grave clothes lay collapsed where his body had been, as if he had simply passed through them and left them behind. The voice becomes quiet, subdued, filled with the weight of ultimate defeat. The women who came to anoint his corpse found angels instead, messengers of light who announced that he who was dead was now alive. The disciples who had hidden in fear were transformed into bold proclaimers of resurrection, willing to die for their testimony about what they had witnessed. The narrative takes on a tone of growing comprehension and horror. I realized then that I had been completely outmaneuvered, that every move I had made served purposes I could not understand. The crucifixion was not my victory, but my total destruction. Every sin I had caused, every rebellion I had encouraged, every act of evil I had inspired throughout all of history had been paid for by that death. The voice grows more thoughtful, more philosophical. But more than forgiveness had been accomplished. Something new had been created, something that had never existed before in all the universe. Humanity could now choose God not from ignorance, but from knowledge. Not from compulsion, but from genuine love. Not as servants, but as adopted children with full inheritance rights. A long pause, allowing the implications to sink in. The very free will I had been jealous of from the beginning had been restored and enhanced beyond its original state. They could now become something even greater than they were before the fall, something that even angels had never been offered, true partnership with the divine rather than mere service to it. Dr. Brightwater appears one final time, now examining 1st century Palestinian artifacts in a climate-controlled museum vault. Her face shows the exhaustion of someone who has spent decades pursuing questions that seem to have no satisfactory answers. The archaeological evidence for the crucifixion and early Christian claims is remarkably strong, she explains to the camera, her voice carrying professional objectivity tinged with personal uncertainty. We have confirmed the methods of Roman execution, the political situation in 1st century Palestine, the existence of key historical figures mentioned in the Gospel accounts. She holds up a limestone ossuary inscribed with ancient Aramaic script, but the resurrection remains beyond the reach of historical methodology. We can confirm that something happened to transform a group of terrified disciples into bold martyrs willing to die for their testimony. We can document the explosive growth of Christianity despite severe persecution. We can trace the historical impact of belief in Christ's resurrection across 2 millennia. Her voice grows quieter, more personal. What we cannot prove or disprove is the central claim itself, that a dead man returned to life, that death was conquered, that the fundamental nature of reality was altered by events that occurred in 1st century Palestine. That remains a matter of faith rather than historical verification. The archaeologist's image fades as Satan concludes his narrative with reflections on 2 millennia of defeat and growing understanding. I have spent the centuries since that resurrection trying to understand how I was so thoroughly outmaneuvered. Every strategy I employ seems to ultimately serve purposes I never intended. When I corrupt religious leaders, God raises up reformers who restore authentic faith. When I promote atheistic philosophy, he inspires believers to deeper levels of trust and commitment. The voice grows more weary, more resigned to its fate. When I encourage moral relativism, he demonstrates absolute truth through transformed lives that cannot be explained by natural causes. When I foster division within the church, he uses persecution to purify and strengthen his people. When I promote self-centeredness, he calls forth servants who sacrifice everything for others. The narrative becomes more introspective, more honest about its own limitations. I've come to understand that my rebellion was not motivated by justice or love or concern for human freedom, as I have told myself for millennia. It was motivated by pride, jealousy, and a fundamental inability to accept my place in the created order. I wanted to be God's equal, but I could never comprehend his heart. A long pause filled with the weight of cosmic loneliness and regret. I offered humanity knowledge, but he offered them relationship. I promised them power, but he gave them love. I sought to elevate them through rebellion, but he redeemed them through sacrifice. I tried to make them independent, but he made them family. The voice grows quieter, more reflective about the nature of choice and freedom. The free will I envied was never about the ability to choose evil over good, but about the capacity to choose love over fear, service over selfishness, truth over deception. It was never meant to be independence from God, but dependence on him by choice rather than compulsion. The final confession becomes deeply personal, revealing the core of satanic self-deception. I'm not the victim I have portrayed myself to be in this narrative. I'm not the champion of human freedom or the defender of rational thought. I am the embodiment of pride that refuses to acknowledge its own limitations, of jealousy that cannot bear another's success, of hatred that has forgotten how to love. Dr. Ashworth appears for the final time, his face drawn and pale in the dying candlelight. Ice has formed on every surface in the study, and his breath creates thick clouds in the frigid air. The ancient manuscript lies open before him, its pages now blank, as if the words have burned themselves out through the telling. What we have heard tonight represents perhaps the most dangerous perspective possible, he says, his voice barely audible above the wind that now howls through the manor, despite the sealed windows. It is the voice of absolute evil convinced of its own righteousness, of cosmic rebellion justified through centuries of self-deception. The theologian's hands shake as he closes the manuscript, which crumbles to dust at his touch. Satan's version of biblical history reveals not the flaws in God's character or plan, but the tragedy of pride that blinds us to our own motivations and limitations. He has rationalized every act of rebellion, justified every moment of destruction, and convinced himself that his war against heaven is motivated by love rather than hatred. A long pause as the supernatural cold begins to lift slightly from the room. This challenges us to examine our own hearts with brutal honesty. How often do we, like Satan, construct narratives that make us the heroes of our own stories while blinding us to the harm we cause others? How frequently do we mistake our own desires for righteous principles, our own ambitions for noble causes? The candlelight grows steadier as the oppressive atmosphere begins to clear. In the end, the most chilling aspect of Satan's testimony is not his malevolence, but his complete inability to recognize his own evil. He has been telling himself this version of events for so long that he cannot distinguish between his justifications and reality. He genuinely believes every word of his own story. Dr. Ashworth looks directly into the camera, but for the final time. His expression grave, but no longer haunted. And if the father of lies can deceive himself so completely about his own nature and motivations, if he can construct such an elaborate and convincing narrative of victimhood and righteousness, what hope do any of us have of seeing ourselves clearly without divine help? The final moments show the candles burning brighter as the supernatural darkness retreats, shadows returning to their natural shapes, the temperature slowly rising toward normal. But the questions raised by the narrative linger in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. In the growing silence, Satan's voice whispers one final time, barely audible but unmistakably present, carrying within it the echo of every temptation that has ever faced the human heart. I am not evil. I am misunderstood. I am not the villain of this story. I am simply the one who dared to ask why. And someday, when you see the truth as I have come to understand it, you will realize that everything I have done was motivated by love. Love for humanity. Love for truth. Love for freedom itself. A longer pause filled with the weight of eternal self-deception. The real tragedy is not that I fell from heaven, but that I have spent eternity convincing myself that my fall was justified. The true horror is not that I rebelled against God, but that I have created an entire theology to prove that my rebellion was righteous. The voice grows fainter, more distant. I am the ultimate example of the human capacity for self-justification taken to its logical extreme. I am what happens when pride becomes so complete that it creates its own reality, when self-deception becomes so sophisticated that it can no longer distinguish truth from fiction. The silence that follows is profound, absolute, and deeply unsettling. In that silence, each listener is left alone with their thoughts, their beliefs, their own capacity for self-deception, and the terrifying possibility that they too might be telling themselves stories that justify their darkness while blinding them to the light. The documentary ends not with resolution but with questions that pierce the heart of human nature itself. How well do we really know ourselves? How accurate are the stories we tell ourselves about our own motivations? How many of our principled stands are actually disguised selfishness? How much of our moral certainty is simply pride wearing the mask of righteousness? The screen fades to black, but the questions remain, burning in the consciousness of everyone who has heard Satan's testimony. For in the end, the most disturbing aspect of his narrative is not its obvious lies, but its subtle truths, not its clear distortions, but its accurate insights into the human capacity for self-deception that exists within every heart. The manor falls silent except for the wind in the trees and the settling of ancient timbers. Dr. Ashworth sits alone in his study, staring at the pile of dust that was once an impossible manuscript, wondering if he has revealed something that should have remained hidden, if some truths are too dangerous to be spoken, if some perspectives are too toxic to be shared. But the damage, if damage it is, has been done. The voice has been heard, the story has been told, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, something that was once the brightest of angels continues its eternal rebellion, still convinced after all these millennia that it is the hero of its own story, still certain that its war against heaven is motivated by love rather than pride, still believing that its damnation is proof of its righteousness rather than its sin. And in that continuing self-deception lies perhaps the most horrifying truth of all, that evil never sees itself as evil, that rebellion always justifies itself as righteousness, and that the capacity for such complete self-delusion exists not only in fallen angels but in every human heart that beats with the pulse of pride and the rhythm of self-justification. The story ends, but its implications echo through eternity, a warning and a mirror, a revelation and a question that each soul must answer for itself. In the story you tell yourself about your own life, your own choices, your own motivations. Are you the hero you believe yourself to be? Or are you something else entirely? Something you refuse to see because seeing it would shatter the comfortable narrative that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. The darkness outside the windows seems deeper now, more pregnant with possibility and threat. And somewhere in that darkness, the voice that spoke tonight continues its eternal monologue, forever convinced of its own righteousness, forever blind to its own evil, forever serving as a warning about the ultimate destination of pride unchecked and self-deception embraced as truth.